So this is the Meng 1/35th scale concrete and plastic barrier set. Initially, when I saw this advertised, I thought that I was only getting these 6 items as barriers. And at the price of around $9 to $13, that seemed a little steep for only 6 barriers for the number that I would need. So what we're going to do is I'm just going to show you what was in the box when it arrived, and I'll show you that it actually turns out that it's a far greater value than what you might expect. So when you open the box, you see a total of 5 concrete barriers. You see 3 that are supposed to represent concrete barriers, and 2 of them which are of the variety that you'd fill with water on site. Now, the ones that represent the concrete have been textured, and you can see that they've been weathered a little bit. You'll also notice that there are indentations in the bottom, which would often be used for a forklift to pick them up and position them. And while I didn't glue them in, there are cast little tiny steel rings which would go here and here that would enable them to be lifted with a crane and some straps. So there are 3 of these. The quality of the cast is very high, and there's no mold lines either. So that was really, that was a pleasant surprise. So these 3 items are in there. There are also 2 items here that represent barriers that are made of plastic that are filled with water on site. The interesting thing about them is that they kind of have a tongue and groove connection to them. You can see here the groove is on this one, and if I turn this one correctly, you can see the tongue for that. And so these can actually be put together in that manner if you so chose. And those items are obviously just for painting. They've also added a few of these small traffic cones and a couple of traffic cone bases. Now, this might be difficult to see with the detail, but ideally you're supposed to stack these things on top of each other and then put a cone on top of it to give the illusion of a stack of these cones. So that was a pleasant surprise. Now, what really excited me, and I've already used these pieces, are 2 pieces of a mold, which you can use to cast your own. The instructions that come with it suggest that you put these pieces together, and then you fill it with gypsum wallboard filler, and then cast it. Now, I found that the instructions don't work as well as other options that are available. So what I found works better is, instead of using gypsum wall filler, to use casting plaster, which you can get at a hobby shop fairly inexpensively. Also, when you look at this mold, there's no real way to hold this thing together. And I tried rubber bands, but it kept falling over. What I eventually settled on were these small spring clips, which I was able to get very cheaply from a home improvement store. And if you put 2 of these small clips together, it almost looks like a little sawhorse, but you can pour your plaster in there and then leave it overnight. So I've cast a number of these with the plaster. It's very simple to mix. You mix it up until it's about the consistency, maybe a little thinner than toothpaste. Pour it inside, leave it overnight. Something else you'll want to do before pouring in the plaster is obtaining a bottle of this. Now, unfortunately, it's almost impossible to read this label, but this is mold release agent or mold release conditioner. This was actually more expensive than the Meng set, but there's enough of this here to last me for a really long time. If you just pour in the plaster or the gypsum when you go to pry your mold apart, you'll end up with pieces being stuck in the mold, which is fine if you want it to look weathered, but if you wanted a newer look, you definitely want to use the mold release agent. So, just as an example, here is a plaster cast of that jersey barrier, of this concrete barrier. And there are some slight mold releases, but if you mix the plaster well enough and it's got enough fluid in it, you're not really going to have any markings or dents or anything else. Now, obviously, if you're doing this for your terrain, you're probably going to find that a number of these barriers won't be absolutely new looking, so you can distress them. And I found that just taking a razor knife to them, and you can take some chunks out of the edges, and some of these you can weather pretty savagely. This one looks a little bit like it has like some bullet holes in it or something. But when you go to lay these things out, you know, they'll convincingly look like those Jersey barriers which you see on the roads. And it's a really nice way of doing like a half wall or something that will afford partial cover in a skirmish game. So the time has come for a quick tutorial. We're going to begin just by spraying our mold release agent. You want to make sure you get it down into all the corners. And then we let that air dry. Once that's air dried, then we'll move on to the next step and we'll actually pour the plaster. And we are prepared for our next step. The next thing we have to do, now that we have the two pieces of our mold here, and you can see that the mold release agent has dried completely in the air, we're going to put our mold together and we have to find some way to hold this thing closed. As I had mentioned earlier in this video, the most effective way I found were these small, inexpensive hardware store spring clamps. And they create something like this little sawhorse looking effect. So now that our mold is ready, our next step is going to be to prepare our plaster so that it can be poured. For this, we're going to need some plaster. We're going to need a small plastic cup to mix it in. We're going to need a little bit of water. And we're also going to need something to mix it with. Now, customarily, I just use an old plastic brush, which is what we'll use today. So the first step is to put in, and you'll have to just do this by eye based on how much is in your mold. And you end up wasting some of this when you do it, but by the same token, it's so incredibly inexpensive, it really doesn't take that much from you. So you can see that it's white powder that you put in here, and we'll add just a little bit of water to this. Now, you can always add more, but once you add too much, your only recourse is to add more plaster. So we start mixing it up. The consistency that you are looking for is somewhere between maple syrup and toothpaste. And what I have right here is actually a little bit too runny, so we're going to add a little more plaster, and we're going to mix it up again. The idea is that you want it to be liquid enough that you can pour it, but you want it to be solid enough that it isn't going to run through the cracks between the pieces of your mold. And I think we actually have a pretty good mix right there. So we're going to take our mold, and we're just going to, I'll turn it this way, I suppose. We're just going to pour it down inside of there. And you can use your stirring stick to help it down if necessary. Yeah, this probably could have stood a little bit more water. Okay, and that is more than enough. Now, one of the things that I learned early on is that you need to tap on a hard surface, because that will bring these bubbles to the surface. See these small bubbles? If you don't bring the bubbles to the surface, they will appear in your finished casting, and there'll be small holes. So if you want something that looks relatively new, you're not going to want the holes. As you can see there, we're pretty much level. Yeah, I like that. And this is where we leave it. We'll leave it for a minimum of 4 hours. I prefer to leave it overnight. But then, when it's ready for us to open it, we'll crack it open in the morning. So we'll see you then. All right, we've waited overnight, and now it's time for us to crack open our mold and see what happens. We're going to start by removing the spring clamps. And then I found that if you just try to pull this thing apart with your hands, you'll often break whatever it is you're trying to mold, especially because while the plaster is largely set, it's still wet. You can even feel the dampness when you run your finger on it. So what I'll do, and sometimes it takes a little bit of monkeying around, I will use a razor knife, not the blade edge, but the flat side of the blade, which is thin enough to begin working around the outside. And with this particular mold, I find I get best results if I can get in behind this edge and kind of pull it out. So we're going to play with this a little bit and try to get it to loosen out. Okay, there's one. There, now as you can see, a little bit of this still stayed inside. Fortunately, when this breaks off, it leaves a damaged concrete kind of appearance on the finished piece. So this one didn't cast perfectly, but we'll do what we can and make it let go. So we're going to work a little on this guy, work a little on this guy, and we're going to pull gently from this direction. Okay, almost. Doesn't want to let go of the bottom this time. Okay, and this side actually cast perfectly. Now that we have looked at it, you'll see there are, and I'm not sure if this camera can catch this detail, but there are very small hair-like mold lines that run around the outside. This is still a little damp, but you can use that same flat edge of your razor knife to take most of that out while it's still a little damp. You could also wait until it's dry and it'll come off that way too. And there it is, a plaster cast 135 concrete highway barrier. So the Meng product works as advertised. Overall, I'm very pleased with the results that I've been receiving. I think you'll have no problem getting good results too. So yeah, this is definitely a product that I recommend. So if you do decide to use it, please make a comment in the video. Let me know what your experience was. If you like this video, please consider clicking the like button. And if you want to see more videos like this, please subscribe to your video. I really appreciate it. Thanks so much. We'll see you next time.